people cried out to Samuel and said, "We want a king." And God said, "Okay, you can have a king, but here's what you get with it." So it really wasn't a good idea to have a king. It's a much better idea to have God reign over us, through a high priest, which is what we will get to in the millennial kingdom. So as we went through kings, remember the first king was King Saul. He was the one that Samuel, who was the prophet and the high priest, he was the first one he had anointed as a king. And Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin. And that was kind of odd because it was always that we were looking at the line of Judah, as being the lineage to Jesus as being the ultimate king that would sit on the throne. But he was of the tribe of Judah. Of the tribe of Benjamin. He was king 40 years, and we'll kind of get into this in a minute, but we see because of his sins that God took the kingship away from him and gave it to David. David was the first king of the line of Judah, and he was the one. Remember I showed you in the lineage in Matthew and the lineage in Luke. One is the lineage through his son Nathan, one is lineage through his son Solomon. One is the mother's line, one is the father's line, and then they come back together. And it's such an incredible coincidence, for lack of a better term, that they both go back to King David. So we saw him as the king. He was the king after God's own heart. He wasn't without sin, but he was also would ask for forgiveness. Then we had Solomon. Solomon reigned for 40 years, and he was the one. King David wanted to build the temple, but because of him, the bloodshed, right, which would have been who? Uriah, possibly, the husband of Bathsheba. Because of bloodshed, he was not allowed to build the temple, but he was allowed to get everything together. He did all the plans, got all the materials together, got all the workers together, and then his son, King Solomon, was the one who built the temple. So King Solomon, we see here on this chart, had built the temple, and then when King Solomon died, the 12 tribes of Israel separated. Solomon's son Rehoboam became king. But because of taxation, believe it or not, the northern tribes separated. And the northern tribes were given to Jeroboam. Remember, Jeroboam had been a leader under Solomon. He had been responsible for a lot of the big construction projects and stuff. And remember that the prophet had gone to Jeroboam with a new cloak on and had taken the cloak off and tore it into 12 pieces and said, take 10 of the pieces. God is going to give you 10 of the tribes into your hand. And so Jeroboam ended up separating with the northern tribes that became known as the tribes of Israel. And the southern tribes under Jeroboam, which was Judah and Benjamin, became the tribes of Judah. That's where we get the term Jews from, the tribe of Judah. But it's actually two tribes. It's a combination of Judah and Benjamin. Now, the one thing that was significant here, remember in the Old Testament, they had been told that 3 times during the year they were to have corporate worship, meaning that they were all to come together, and at that time it would have been at the tabernacle, at the place of God's dwelling. And these were Feasts of Unleavened Bread, which is, remember, on the 14th day of the first month we have Passover. Then that's that night. Then the next morning starts the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's the 15th and runs for 7 days. They were legally required for that week, to everyone was supposed to go to the temple for the feast. And then on Pentecost, 7 weeks, 50 days later, on Pentecost, they were supposed to come back to the temple again for corporate worship. And then one other time, which was Feast of Tabernacles. That would have been in the 7th month, from the 15th day to the 21st day. So these 3 times during the year, they were required by law to return to the temple for a corporate gathering and corporate worship. what happened is once they separated into a northern and southern tribe, the northern tribes could no longer go back to the temple. They were now had become enemies, in effect. And so they wouldn't travel back to the temple. So they weren't going back to the temple anymore. So that Jeroboam started putting up, because of the surrounding tribes, or the surrounding peoples and their gods would start infiltrating into them. Pretty soon they were worshiping Baals and Ashtoreths and all these other gods. And so they got away from going to the temple. They got away from going to the house of God, the one house of God. And so because of that, they started getting further and further away from following Yahweh God, right? Well, this, in 1 Kings, the book of 1 Kings goes through this. And I had said that as we go through when you're reading 1 Kings, it starts out a pretty easy read through David and Solomon, but then it gets kind of confusing because it will spend one or two chapters talking about the tribes of Judah and the kings, and then the tribes of Israel and the kings, and tribe of Judah. So it's bouncing back and forth, telling kind of just short descriptions about each one of these kings. Now notice in this chart, which is your chart 45, that anything that is shaded is a bad king or a wicked king, and anything that is not shaded was a good king or a king that would follow God. And notice on the northern tribes up here, there's not a whole lot of non-shaded kings, are there? You can see, in fact, that just about all of them were bad. And a lot of that is because they're no longer going to the temple. They're no longer worshiping. Another thing that's happened is remember, each tribe had a small amount of Levites in with them that were the spiritual leaders for each one of the tribes. Well, a lot of them have started rebelling and moving to Judah. So a lot of the northern tribes, all of their priests and Levites would leave and go to the southern tribes. And then Jeroboam would institute other, his own priests and stuff in these areas. So the book of 1 Kings has taken us through this. And the split between 1st and 2nd Kings is kind of right about here, between Elisha and Elijah. So there really isn't any difference in the two, but this is kind of the dividing point. So 1 Kings, kind of the lead prophet there is Elijah, and then Elisha is kind of the lead prophet of the 2nd Kings. Now, notice that these two, Elijah and Elisha, they are prophets. They are prophets sent to prophesy against the northern tribes. They're prophesying against these ones that they basically have no spiritual connection to the temple anymore. Remember Elijah? Remember Ahab and his wife, Jezebel? And Jezebel had the 450 prophets or priests of Baal, and they had the contest about burning the altar. So this is kind of what happens here. So where we left off last week was right in here. We're in 2 Kings. It's bouncing back and forth between the two, and we've gotten to a time of about 860, 850 BC. So tonight we'll continue from that in 2 Kings, and then also go through Chronicles. Okay, so Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this beautiful day. Thank you for an opportunity for all of us to be here, to be together in your house, and just to look into your word in an in-depth manner. And Father, just ask you to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to your word. And God, I just ask you to give me guidance and direction through your Holy Spirit, just that the things I say are logical and understandable and the truths from you, Father. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So, from your notes, we're starting in chapter 12 in our books, which starts about 2 Kings. And the two main prophets in this book are Elijah and Elisha again. Now, Elijah was taken up to heaven in chapter 2. So right after we get started into 2 Kings, he's taken up into heaven. Elijah was taken up into heaven. Who else was taken into heaven without dying? Enoch, right? So those two have been taken into heaven. a lot of people think like the witnesses, the two witnesses in the time of Revelation, a lot of people think it'd be like Moses and Elijah. I'm kind of under the feeling it might be Elijah and Enoch because neither died, and it is appointed once for every man to die. We're probably all wrong, but it's interesting that there's only two that we know of that are taken into heaven and don't experience death. So Elijah has been God's spokesman to the northern tribes. Remember, he's talking to the northern ones, the ones that are away from the temple. And he was a central figure of 1 Kings. He was known for great public works. Everything he did was a big public display. Let's have everybody go out and let's have your 450 prophets of Baal come out and build an altar, and I'll build an altar, and we'll try to call fire down. And so it was always like a big act, something big. Elisha, he was the key person of 2 Kings. He was God's spokesman to the northern kingdom also. He did a large number of miracles, but on a very small basis, typically one-on-one, healing a person, providing for a person, typically small stuff. So Elijah was major. Elisha was kind of minor acts of what they did in miracles. So he demonstrated God's grace, love, and tenderness. In looking at comparisons to these, Elijah was like John the Baptist and the messenger of repentance of sin, and Elisha doing good deeds, the kindness and miracles attesting that the words of the prophet were from God. So it's almost kind of like in the Old Testament, God did big things. Like coming out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea. His miracles were big, but Jesus' miracles were typically on a one-to-one basis. So these two, it's kind of similar to this. Elijah doing the major things like God did, and Elisha doing the minor things like Jesus did. So there's a little bit of a comparison there in looking at types. So the northern kingdoms never went to the temple in Jerusalem to worship, like we had talked about. Under the persecution of Jeroboam, remember Jeroboam was the northern tribes. He was the guy that got the 10 tribes of the northern tribes. Under Jeroboam, most of the Levites and priests and devout worshipers of God had fled to Judah. Remember, anyone who's really serious about worshiping God, first of all, you're going to want to follow the commandments. One of the commandments is that on those 3 times, on unleavened bread, on Feasts of Weeks, and on tabernacles, that they have to go to the temple to worship. So anyone who's living there and can't go is going to flee and go to the southern tribes. So a lot of the Levites and those that really worship God would have left. So now we're in the northern tribes. They're separated from the temple, and now all their priests have left. So all of their Levite leaders have left too. So it gets wicked pretty fast. So it's understandable why they were the first ones to go into captivity. So the prophets in the northern tribe had become the priests. Now, Samaria had become the capital. And let me zoom in here to Egypt again. If we look at Israel, the nation of Israel, right here we see Jerusalem. So from Jerusalem and everything south is in the tribe of Judah. So if we draw a line right about across here, everything to the south of that or below that is going to be Judah. Everything north of that is going to be Israel. When they separated, Jerusalem had been the capital or the head city. Well, after they separated, then Samaria became the head city of the northern tribes. And Samaria is obviously still there, pretty small, but Samaria became kind of like the capital city or the lead city of the northern tribes. And in 722, they've become wicked. In 2 Kings, we continue the story of the northern tribes, southern tribes, northern tribes, southern tribes. It bounces back and forth. But we get to the point that in 722, after Hosea, that they go into captivity. Now I'm going to go back to a chart 4 from our actual introduction. You can just see it here on the chart up here. And what this shows is a timeline and who is in power. Who is in power right now? Who is the major military power? Probably us. It's debatable whether or not China's catching up or Russia. But it's kind of like, we've been the major power in the world, the past 50 since World War II. And this is kind of the same thing there. If we look back in time, we had a time when, at this time, Assyria was the major power. Throughout time, first of all, we had Egypt as a major power. Then Israel became a pretty important power. Then if we look up here, Assyria becomes a power. And then at some point in time, at 612 BC, if you see here Babylon becomes a power. Who is the head of Babylon? Who is the king of Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. And then after Nebuchadnezzar, right around 530, 519 BC, then we have the Persian Empire becoming a power. So what's kind of important here through the book of Kings is knowing that Assyria is a major power for a while, and then Babylon becomes a power, and then Persia becomes a power. So right now in the northern tribes, they are under the major military power there is Assyria. Assyria, where is the capital of Assyria? It's Nineveh. Who went to Nineveh? Jonah. Yeah, so when we get into the prophets, we'll talk about Jonah. Assyria is all the region north. Okay, right about here would be the northern end of the nation of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. And then Assyria is this region out here, and then way over here is Nineveh. So right now during the northern tribes, Assyria, with the capital of Nineveh, is the lead power. Because they are the lead power, they have taken over a lot of what's going on in Israel, in the northern tribes of Israel, and they have imposed taxes on it. And so they have become like a controlling power over them. So a lot of them going into captivity, first of all, they went into captivity because they had sinned against God, right? They turned against God. If they had stayed true to God, that would have never happened. But they end up going to captivity in 722 BC into Nineveh. Now, when they went into captivity in Nineveh, when they were into Assyria, they never returned. So if you ever heard the terms the lost tribes of Israel, these are the 10 northern tribes that went into captivity in Assyria because they never did return back to their land. So in chapter 17 of 2 Kings, we see this story. And Hosea was the last ruler of the northern tribes, and Samaria was the capital, and they fell to the Assyrians. So in 722, they went into captivity. Now let me back up to this chart again. And in this chart, and we've seen it, and it just goes through where we have the time of the kings, and then it splits into Israel and Judah, and then we come over here, and then right here we're at the end of Israel, and that is under the power of Assyria, so the Assyrians take over them. But look what happens here. The southern tribes, Judah, they don't go into captivity until 586 BC, a couple hundred years later. But what happens in this time is Assyria is overtaken by the Babylonians. So the Babylonians become the lead power. So the northern tribes, Israel, went into captivity by the Assyrians. Does that make sense? And the southern tribes will later go into captivity by the Babylonians. And while they are in captivity in Babylon, there's another power change, and the Persians take over power. And so we'll see this at the end of the second chapter of Chronicles. And there's something very interesting by a guy named Cyrus. I'm serious, it was Cyrus. Okay. On page 202, there's a map. And I am in the wrong set of charts. Excuse me. And this map just shows these areas. We have, notice now, okay, here's the Dead Sea, here's the Jordan River, here's the Sea of Galilee. Have Israel in the north, we have Judah in the south. And then up here we have the Assyrian Empire, and over here we have the Babylonian Empire. Assyrian Empire, the capital of it is Nineveh. Interesting, see how far Nineveh is from the Mediterranean? It's about 450 miles. So Nineveh is a long way from the coast. I remember one time I was listening to a pastor, and he was talking about Jonah and how Jonah had gotten expelled by the great fish onto the shore right at the gates of Nineveh. He might have been geographically challenged, but so Jonah still had a long walk after he got out of the belly of the fish. So Nineveh is quite a ways from the coast. So when you think of Jonah and the story of the great fish, he still had a long way to go once he got back to shore. Okay, so this map just kind of shows some of the areas of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So the immediate cause that brought the kingdom's overthrow was Hosea's conspiracy against the king of Assyria. Remember, Assyria was imposing taxes and control over them. But the underlying cause of Israel's overthrow was a persistent sin and rejection of God. Remember, this is a people that consistently built altars to Baal, altars to Ashtaroth, was completely away from worshiping God, had taken in all these other gods from surrounding areas. So that was ultimately the cause of the fall of Syria, or the fall into the hands of the Syrians. Now, when that happened, when the Assyrians went in and took over the northern tribes of Israel, and they hauled them all as captive. Well, what they did is, rather than leaving the land empty, they imported a bunch of their people from Assyria into that area. So the northern tribes was repopulated by people that the Assyrians brought in after they took the Israelites captive. These people became the Samaritans. These were people that had been imported by Assyria during this captivity and kind of replaced the people they took out. They didn't want to just leave the land empty. So this became the Samaritans. So this was a people that had come in from Assyria, but yet there were still some of the Israelites, the tribes of Israel, that had been left. So it becomes kind of a breeding pot of some of the people from the northern 10 tribes and these new people that came in. So remember the woman at the well when Jesus talked to her? She knew a lot about God. She knew a lot she knew the law, she knew the Bible, she knew the commandments. This is why she was a Samaritan. She was, in effect, kind of a half-breed between these two. But she still had some roots and stuff from being one of the 12 tribes of Israel. So when you hear the term Samaritans, that's these people that have been brought in. So they're kind of a half-breed people. So that would understand why they were always looked down upon. You don't want to talk to a Samaritan, or if you see them laying by the side of the road, you don't help them. That's why those stories took place like that. Okay, so that's kind of chapter 17 is talking about the fall of Samaria. In 18, now what has happened now is that they have gone into captivity, or the northern tribes have gone into captivity, right? So now the story gets a little easier to follow. So now at chapter 18, we're right here. The northern tribes have gone into captivity. So now 2 Kings goes back to, it's just talking about the southern tribes. So when you're reading Kings, it's bouncing back and forth, and you have to read, okay, we're talking about Israel, now we're talking about Judah, now we're talking about Israel, now we're talking about Judah. So once we get to this point in the story, then it's just about the southern tribes. So it's a little easier to follow. And it comes in right here at Hezekiah. So now then we're going to be Hezekiah, um, Manasseh, and then uh, Josiah. But you see we have 2 good kings and 3 bad kings left in the southern tribes. So now we're in Hezekiah in chapters 18 through 20. So at the time of the fall of the northern tribes, Ahaz was king over Judah, the southern tribes. Ahaz was an evil king, but his son Hezekiah was a God-fearing king, who God used to purge the corruptions of Ahaz and restore true worship to the kingdom. So Hezekiah, you see this switch from his father, who was wicked. Hezekiah returns to God, and one of his big campaigns is to go in and destroy all of these temples. When we get to later on in this, in chapters 25 through 26, we see the fall of Jerusalem. Remember, David had taken the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites. He had made it the capital of the southern tribes. And then what happens in chapters 25 of 2 Kings is we get to the fall of Jerusalem. And if we see over here, this happens at 586 BC, when the southern tribes go into captivity. Now, they had the temple. They had a closer walk with God. They were obviously closer to him physically having the temple. But they were still getting away from God through Jehoiakim and Zedekiah. Now, by this time, if you'll notice from this other chart, the northern tribes in 722, they went into Assyria under captivity. Then after they went into captivity, about 80 years later, Babylon becomes the world power. And so now Babylon is the world power under Nebuchadnezzar. And under Nebuchadnezzar, he's the one who takes the southern tribes into captivity. So now there's a power switch, and now Babylon comes in power. It'd be like us trying to go in and take over Mexico or Canada or whatever, or them taking over us. So in 586 BC, Jerusalem fell to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Judah's kings, priests, and people were utterly corrupt. And it's amazing how we can go from a time when you have such renewal under Hezekiah and then Josiah, and then end up totally corrupt. But if you look at that, that's a period of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years, so we're 2 or 3 generations later, and everyone's forgotten about God. Do we see that happening in the U.S. now? It seemed like we were a very godly nation, especially during World War I, World War II era. I mean, like my parents' era. And then it's like we've gotten so far away, and it's so quick, just 2 or 3 generations, and you're totally away from God. No one knows anything about God. I was talking to the 10th Hour Project kids, and I was asking them, I said, and I told them, I said, when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s going to school, it seemed like at least half of the kids, or 2/3, knew about God and were being taken to church. Isn't that about right, like when you guys were kids? It seems like if you talk to 3 kids, at least 2 of you were taken to church, whether you liked it or not. And I asked them, I said, you as young adults, 18 to 25, how many of you, like in your classes, how many in a class knew anything about God and went to church? And they told me it's probably between 1 in 20 and 1 in 30. That's scary, isn't it? So there's no more knowledge. So when we see this here, like on this chart, it's understandable. It's happening to us. I mean, we're totally away from God. So nothing changes. It just keeps repeating. So what has happened here is they become totally corrupt, and God uses, God can use anyone for his purpose. He used Nebuchadnezzar for his purpose, right? And his purpose was to take them into captivity. And it wasn't necessarily that God just hated his children and wanted to punish them, but he's trying to get them back. And if he has to take them into captivity, get them back, then, praise God, use that. Okay, in chart 51, page 203, this kind of shows the difference in the world power. See, back in here, okay, now we're just talking down here about the southern tribes, Hezekiah through Zedekiah. And then we had Assyria as being the lead power. And then we get to this point around here between 612 BC and 605, and now Babylon has become the power under Nebuchadnezzar. So under Nebuchadnezzar, the southern tribes are going to go into captivity. How long did they go into captivity for? It was 70 years. The northern tribes, remember I said the northern tribes are called like the lost tribes of Israel because they never returned? The southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, they're allowed to return 70 years later. What's crazy about it is you probably had several million people taken into captivity, but only about 60 or 70,000 returned. 70 years is a long time. That's like your grandkids. So now it's 70 years later when they return, it's like another generation, maybe 2 generations later. And this is generations now that they didn't come from Jerusalem. They know nothing about Israel, but some of them decided to go back. It'd be like me going back to Ireland, where my grandfather came from, but even though I've never been to Ireland. If that was my choice, I don't think I'd go. Might go visit, but yeah, so there's just a small return. Why was it 70 years? Believe it or not, is over the 7-year rest for the land. One of the laws they had was that in agriculture, every 7th year you're supposed to let your land rest for a year. That was one of God's laws, and they had gone 490 years and not let the land rest, so God said, I will have my 70 years of rest for the land. So nothing happened on that land for 70 years, and he let them return to it. And when you look at that, God said that every 7th year let your land rest. On the 6th year, I will double the output of it, so that you'll have enough to hold you over for that 1 year. Let the land rest and then repeat. I've got some good friends that have like 50,000 acres of wheat in Seymour, Texas, and I always ask them if they let it rest every 7th year. And they said there's no way our banks and finances would let us do that. But I wonder how much blessed they would be if they did. Anybody here farmers or do agriculture? I've always wondered if you actually let land rest every 7th year, how your profits would go up. But that was the reason that it was 70 years, and they were able to return later. Okay, so this chart 51 shows that the last king of Judah, and after the capture of Israel, Hezekiah and Josiah were both God-fearing, but as soon as they were gone, the people returned to idol worship. If we look here, remember the bottom, these are all of the prophets listed. And look how many prophets are down here. We have Nahum, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, Amon. There's a lot of prophets right here warning them. One thing to notice is that Isaiah back over here, he was warning them. Micah was warning them. A lot of times God was sending these prophets in 200 years, 300 years before they were taken captive to start warning them. So it'd be like someone coming in here and say, if you don't turn back to God in 23:15, I'm going to bring destruction on the U.S. We'd be like, so what? Will we listen or will we teach our kids and grandkids? Probably not. But they were warned hundreds of years in advance. So it wasn't like, oh, gee, we didn't know. They had this written down. They had the books of Isaiah and Micah. They knew well in advance what was going to happen. Okay, so as with the northern kingdoms, the southern kingdoms also rejected and mocked the prophet sent by God. I don't know if I've got this diagram on 204. Oh, yes, I do. This is just that diagram again of the time of the kings, right? The time of the northern tribes, and then the time of the southern tribes. Does anybody remember the dates? When did the kings start? That was 1043 BC. At 931 BC was when the tribes separated. So this is 923, then or 931. Then 722 was when the northern tribes went in, and then 586 was when the southern tribes went in captivity. So if you're ever playing like Bible trivia pursuit, these are very important numbers to know. Okay, on chart 52 on page 205, this is kind of an outline of the book of Kings. Remember, Kings is just this kind of a continuation of 1 Kings to 2nd. The dividing is between Elisha and Elijah. And from chapters 1 to 17, it's a divided kingdom. And it's bouncing back and forth between the story of the northern and southern. And kind of the way it's laid out is it's kind of like each chapter is about a king, roughly. Sometimes it's two or something. But it's just a story back and forth between the two divided kingdoms. And it's like this king did good, this king did bad, this king did good, this king did bad. It's more bad than good. And then in 17, Israel goes into captivity. The northern tribes go into captivity. And in 18 through 27, or through 25, are about the surviving kingdom, which is Judah, until Judah finally goes into captivity. And then at the end, in 25, just kind of an epilogue to it. So this gets us through the end of the kings, the time of the kings, and them going into captivity. We have three more, we're talking about the 12 books of history, right? And now we've got three more books left. Ezra, Nehemiah, that is so hard for me to say, Nehemiah and Esther. So those are the last three books of history. And they deal with the southern tribes coming back and rebuilding the city, the temple, the wall, and reestablishing worship. And then there's the story of Esther. Esther is a lot like the story of Ruth. There's some really profound hidden stuff in that. Did you guys ever get a chance to look at that stuff I did on Ruth? Isn't that a neat? It's just there's so much neat stuff there. It's just, well, everything in the Bible is pretty neat when you get into it. Okay. That gets us through 2 Kings. We have gone chronologically from creation all the way up to the southern tribes going into captivity. And the Old Testament, this far through 9 and 5 through 14 books, has been chronological. Now then, the next two books are Chronicles. Chronicles is not a continuation, but it's another picture of the story. And Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, starts from Adam and Eve in the garden again with a genealogy and takes us all the way up to the southern tribes going into captivity. So Chronicles is kind of a condensed version of what we spent the last 7 weeks going through, but in a shortened version. The difference, Kings focuses on both northern and southern tribes. Chronicles just focuses on Judah. The reason for that would be that's the line of our Savior, right? So Chronicles just follows the tribe, Judah, that Jesus comes from. So it's more looking, okay, here's what's going on with the kings of Judah. Here's what's getting ready. Here's where our Savior is going to come from. So it focuses on that. So let's go into 1st and 2nd Chronicles. As I kind of told you last week, the definition in a narrative, the author is looking at like big events and putting emphasis on the big things that happen. And in a chronology, the author is just listing everything that happened, not putting more weight or less weight on any particular item, but just listing everything that happened. So chronology is more, it's kind of like a more monotone reading of something, where a narrative would be a real exciting type, well, this really happened, and this was great, and this was great, yeah. So that's kind of the difference between the narrative that we've gone through and a chronology. Now, Chronicles was written around 450 to 425 BC. What was happening at this time? Remember, that's right before the 400 silent years. So at this time, the southern tribes had gone back to Jerusalem. They had reestablished the city and the wall and the temple. Remember, we had Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. Ezra was the priest. So it is thought that Ezra was the one who wrote this, that he was the one who wrote Chronicles. So that would explain the timeline of 425 to 450 BC. And when we look at these, it looks like when he wrote them that First Chronicles, Second Chronicles, and Ezra were all one continuous story. Later, when these are broken up, typically they're broken up because of how heavy does a scroll gotten for us to carry around. So it's like, this is getting real heavy, let's cut it into two parts. So like in Chronicles, there's really no reason why there's a first and second other than just books that big were hard to carry. Okay, if I look at page 209, there's a chart there, if I've got it. And I think that's it, isn't it? And what this is showing is kind of the comparison between Kings and Chronicles. So Kings was a prophetic perspective, like judgments, and Chronicles is like a priestly perspective. In Kings, war was very prominent. What time? Who was kind of responsible? What was all the wars? When was that happening? Usually kind of the time of David. There's a lot of warring in the time of David. In Chronicles, the temple is very prominent. There's a lot of information given to the temple. Remember, Solomon is the one that's going to build the temple. There's a lot of emphasis on the construction of it, on everything that's put together, on how many workers there were, on how long it took to build. So there's a lot of information on the temple. In Kings, it was the fortune of the thrones. In Chronicles, is a continuation of the Davidic line. Like we've talked about, Kings was recorded both Israel and Judah. And now you know the difference between Israel and Judah. And Chronicles was primarily Judah. And Kings was about morality, and Chronicles is about redemption. Okay. In Chronicles, like I mentioned, the northern kingdoms are hardly mentioned. The three areas of main interest were lineages. In the first 9 books of Chronicles is all lineages. And there's 3 lineages given. There's the Davidic line, David, which is the line of Judah, all the descendants of Judah. Levi, and then also Benjamin. So, remember that first chart I gave you? And we followed like Adam and Seth and Enosh and Mahalalel, and then we got down to Noah. And then from them we went to Shem's line, and we followed Shem's line down to Abram, became Abraham. And then we followed it through Isaac, Jacob, and then his 12 sons. So that's the line of Judah. So this kind of gives a repeat of it. The other 2 that's given is Levi. Remember, Levi was the 4th son of Israel. He was the one that became the priestly leaders. Why would Levi be important? Why do we need a lineage to Levi? Couple reasons. First of all, the southern tribes, remember it's Judah and Benjamin, and then all of the Levites ended up there. So it was their descendancy. What do they need for the 3rd temple? They've got to have priests. This is one of the best lineages for them to use to study to know who was priests now. If you follow Israel and what's going on over there, there's a group called the Temple Mount Institute, and the Levites are already there. They're trained. They are ready to build the 3rd temple. Does God need a 3rd temple? No, we are his temple. But we do know that the temple is going to be rebuilt because the Jews still believe that the Messiah hasn't come. They want to rebuild the temple, so they had to have Levites. So this helped them do that. So this is the tribe of Levites. What about Benjamin? Where did Saul come from? I'm sorry, Samuel. I'm sorry. King Saul. Remember, he was a Benjamite. And so there's a lineage given here from Benjamin, the 11th son of Jacob, all the way down to Saul, King Saul. So there's a lineage there. But it stops with him. So it gives the lineage to him. It gives the lineage of the Levites, which is important for the fulfillment of end-time prophecies, and then also the Judaic line. So when we read this, in the first 9 chapters, it's kind of like trying to read, go back to Numbers or something again and just read all the names. So if you're having insomnia, it's a wonderful 9 chapters to read. The second point is the high point of Judah's history up until the time of captivity. Remember, it's all about Judah's history. And then, if we think about Judah, the thing that's important to them is the southern tribes. They've got Jerusalem. They've got what was the threshing mound. They've got the temple. They've got the priests. They've got the worship. This is where God where God's presence was. So the focus is on that and on his temple. When we see in Revelations in the first 3 chapters, when John is having his revelation of seeing heaven and he sees Jesus, notice we see him walking among the candlesticks. It's like he's in the temple in heaven. So the temple on earth was just a small cut-down version of the temple in heaven. So it's a very significant in what's in it and the way it's set up. From a worship standpoint, from a prophetic standpoint. Well, we have a temple again. When the New Jerusalem descends, during the millennial kingdom, there will be a new Jerusalem, a new worship center. Will we have to go? We will all go 3 times a year. Those laws of God about going to the temple to worship, they aren't abolished. We will go, to the temple. You see that in Revelations. We will go again, to this temple to worship. So it's going to come back. Okay, in chart 53 in 1 Chronicles on page 210, okay, this is kind of the outline of the book of 1 Chronicles. And if we see here, we see chapters 1 through 9 are genealogies. And it starts with Abraham. In 1:1, it starts Abraham from Adam to Abraham. And then the sons of Abraham, the 12 sons. Then the sons of Israel, the sons of David, descendants of Judah, the tribes of Levi, other tribes of Benjamin, and then the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So it goes through these lineages of all these people. It's important that they kept track of who they were. Then in chapter 10, there's a turning point here in this book. Saul dies. And then we have the history of David's reign. So 1 Chronicles is the genealogy, Saul passing away, and then David. There's not a lot of information given about Saul. Basically, there's just like one chapter that talks about his death, about him dying. And then 11 through 21 through 29 are all about David. And David's reign, his sins, the good things he did, the bad things he did. And a lot of emphasis is put on how he was getting ready to build the temple of God. So this is kind of an outline of it. So there's a turning point in the middle. It's history, and then it's all about David in a lot more detail than Kings would have had about David. So in 1:1 through 9:9, we see the genealogy from time of Adam to King Saul and King David. There is a recording of the line of Saul. Saul was a descendant of Benjamin, so the lineage is given in chapter 8 of the Benjamites. Saul became king, even though he's not in line of Judah. And chapter 9 is a brief story of Paul and his last battle and his death. Then in 10 through 29 is about David. And I'd like to look at, in 1 Chronicles 10:13, and I'll just read it to you here, because these are just kind of interesting stories. Now, Saul started out good, right? But remember I showed you how there were several times. Remember one time he was waiting for Samuel to show up to do a sacrifice, and Samuel was late, so he did it himself. And that got him in trouble. One of the main things he did, remember, he was always referring to Samuel. He was always going to Samuel for advice. And when you read that, like in Kings, he always referred to Samuel. He said, ask your God. And I always wondered if that was a significant clue to the true heart of Saul. It was never inquire of our God or inquire of God. It was inquire of your God. When Samuel had died, he had passed away. Well, Saul had to go against the Philistine army again, and he wanted Samuel's his advice. And so he goes to a medium and asks, "Can you conjure up the Saul for me so I can ask him a question?" And whether or not it was truly Saul that came up or an evil spirit, we're not really sure. But in this chapter 10, verse 13, we see, "So Saul died for his unfaithfulness which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, and also because he consulted a medium for guidance." So these things were kind of the downfall of Saul. Now remember, the Spirit of God had been on Saul, right? And then remember, we talked about last week how it lifted, and then in the next verse it says the Spirit of God descended on David and was with him. So God's Spirit had been with him for a while, but then lifted and went to David. So there's just a very short amount of information about Saul, but it says right here why he died. Saul died for unfaithfulness which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, and because he had consulted a medium for guidance. He did not inquire of the Lord, therefore he killed him and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. And then in chapter 11, the next verse says, "Then all Israel came together to David at Hebron, and they made him king." So we see this transition here between chapter 10 and 11 of Saul dying and then David becoming king. So chapter 10 to 13 tell of David's kingdom being conquering Jerusalem and setting up as the main city of Israel, a record of David's mighty men and warriors. Now, in Joshua, they had come into the promised land. They had 7 years of war where they went and drove out all the inhabitants, but they never had taken Jerusalem yet. Jerusalem was inhabited by Jebusites, which were descendants of Canaan. They were Canaanites. And so David was the one several hundred years later that came against Jerusalem and took it. And then he made it the city of David, or Jerusalem. So it wasn't originally a city that David built, but it was one he had taken over. And then we'll talk about it again, but remember that David ended up trying to do a census, and God punished him for that, and he ended up getting the threshing floor, which became the Temple Mount at Jerusalem. So this talks about this here in chapters 10 to 13, talks about him taking Jerusalem. And the way they took it is by getting people to sneak in through the waterway system or sewer system to get in to take the city. So that's how they took Jerusalem. Let's take a break at 7:30, and then we'll continue on. Any questions? Well, we officially just went through the halfway point. There's a dog looking at a horse on the screen. Okay. Whoever brought the eclairs, thank you very much. The fruit was good too. So were the Reese's. Coffee wasn't bad. Okay, so going through back to 1 Kings, chapter 14 starts talking about David's house and family and the defeat of the Philistines. Then remember, the whole second half of 1 Chronicles is about David. So chapter 15 and 16 tells about David having the Ark of the Covenant brought to Jerusalem. Remember last week we talked about like the Philistines captured it and took it off and put it in front of Dagon, and Dagon fell on his face in front of it, and then they finally sent it back. And remember the first time they tried to move it, David had them put it in a cart and pull it with, I guess, a mule or something, and someone touched it to stabilize it and was killed. Read the instructions. You know, if you're in doubt, read the instructions. The instructions were you put poles through it and priests, Levites carry it. So they didn't read the instruction manual. Our instruction manual is right here. Okay, so he brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Remember, he has built his house, and then he builds a tent for the Ark of the Covenant, brings it into a tent. The tabernacle is still in Hebron at this point. They haven't built the temple yet, so this is kind of a temporary place for it to be then later moved into the temple after it's finished. So 15 and 16 tell about bringing the Ark of the Covenant in. In chapter 17, God promises David that his offspring will be the ones to build the house that will be established, and his throne will be established forever. So in 17:11, it says, "And it shall be when your days are fulfilled, when you must go to be with your fathers, that I will set up your seed after you, who will be of your sons, and I will establish his kingdoms. He will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son." So this is where David has promised that his son will be the one to establish that God will establish his kingdom there that will last forever. Then 18 to 20 kind of talks about more battles fought and won by David. Remember, they're still trying to chase out all the Canaanites that keep coming back against them. Chapter 21, we talked earlier about how the Spirit of God came on him, right, on David and on Saul, and then would lift. This is a little different. In chapter 21, we see that David is incited by Satan and took the census of Israel. That's scary to know that King David, who is the man after God's own heart, who is chosen by God to rule over his people, that he can be incited by Satan. Does that mean any of us can stand a chance? Probably not without a lot of prayer and hard work. So when that census happened, it was because Satan incited him. Where else did we see a situation where Satan incites somebody to do something? One of the 12 disciples. Remember in Judas it says, "And Satan entered him." That's spooky. In 21:1, "Now Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel." So David was moved in his heart to take a census. And a lot of that would be, David is king. His kingdom has gotten really, really big. It's really easy to get really prideful and think, wow, how big have I gotten? How many people do I have under me now? And want to count them. So that was what led to it happened kind of towards the end of David's life. So Satan has incited him to do this. He takes the census. The man he asked him to take the census actually leaves out Benjamin and Dan just because he knows it's wrong. We see that in chapter 21, verse 6. But he did not count Levi and Benjamin among them, for the king's word was abominable to Joab. Anyway, this brought on the wrath of God. God gives him the three choices. You can have 3 years of fighting your enemies. You can have 6 months of pestilence, if I remember right, or maybe 3 months of pestilence, or 3 days of the wrath of God. And David says, well, I'd rather have the wrath of God because I know he has mercy. And so this is what ended up him getting the threshing floor to where the temple was built. So in chapter 21, we see this. David is given the choice of 3 years of famine, 3 months of being swept away by your enemies, and 3 days of plague with the angels. See, I should always read my notes rather than trying to remember. Yes? It was actually applied to everyone. But then at the end, David cries out and says, don't harm these sheep. Take out your wrath on me and my family. But it was actually on everybody. So David, 3 days of plague with the angel of the Lord ravaging every part of Israel. David chooses the wrath of God, hoping for his mercy. God sends an angel to destroy Jerusalem, yet he was grieved and stopped the angel before he destroyed it all. The angel of the Lord was standing at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. David asked God to take out his wrath on him and his family and not the innocent sheep. David was told to build the altar of the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah. David purchased the threshing floor from him for 600 shekels, roughly $300,000. This location becomes the Temple Mound. What had happened on this location roughly 1,500 years before? Isaac. Yeah, Abraham and Isaac. Remember that when Abraham takes Isaac up on the mountain, takes him up on the hill to sacrifice him? This was the very same place. Probably where Jacob had his dream of the ladder, ascending and descending to heaven. And says, truly, this is a side of God. Remember Abraham, when he's getting ready to sacrifice Isaac, he sees the burning bush, and this voice in the burning bush says, I will provide myself a sacrifice. God didn't say, I will provide a sacrifice myself. He said, I will provide myself. Like he's saying, I will provide myself as a sacrifice. Him coming as in flesh as his son, sending his son to die for him. So this is the very same place. Okay, so the location there, when he bought the land from this Jebusite, he also bought, the guy also provided bulls and wood, and he made a sacrifice right there and then burned as a sacrifice. So that is talked about here at the end of chapter 21. Chapter 22 to 29 are David preparing for the construction of the temple. Remember, a lot of this is about the temple. And David wanted to build it, but God didn't let him because of the bloodshedding. In this we see in 28:11. Let me read this. Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the vestibule, its houses, its treasuries, its upper chambers and inner chambers, the place of the mercy seat, and the plans for all that he had had by the Spirit, of the courts of the house of the Lord, of all the chambers of all around, all the treasuries of the house, of all the treasuries for the dedicated things, also the divisions of the priests and Levites for all the work and the service of the house of the Lord. So God gave him the blueprint. David gave his son Solomon the blueprints. God had given him all the instructions for how to build it. David had used his money and his wealth and his connections to get all the materials gathered up, the gold, the silver, the wood, everything. So everything was ready to go. And then, so David had all of this ready. So he just basically handed him the cookbook for it and all the ingredients and said, you will go build it. What happened to Solomon? Solomon starts out, he asks for wisdom. God's so impressed that he asks for wisdom that God gives him wisdom and power and strength and money and, peace and everything. But Solomon, it's like he builds the temple, and then later in life, he ends up with all these other wives. He starts, helping them and building altars to their gods and gets away from the worship of God. There's an interesting prayer in this next thing I'm going to read you that I found a few years ago that I thought was just fascinating. Remember we talked about Saul, how Saul was always asking Samuel, go to your God? Okay, this is in 28:20. And David said to his son Solomon, be strong and of good courage, and do it. Do not fear nor be dismayed, for the Lord God, my God, will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you until you have finished all the work for the service of the house of the Lord. Does that strike you as kind of fascinating how that's worded? David says, my God. He doesn't say our God or the God. He says, my God. He also says, my God will be with you until you finish the service of building the house of the Lord. I hope I'm not reading too much into that. But if you kind of look between the lines, perhaps there's a message there that perhaps David and God knew that Solomon's heart would turn. Had anybody seen that before? And I've read it in several different, even in the linear, in the original Hebrew and stuff, and that's a pretty good translation of it. But we know that Solomon, he wrote Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Proverbs. He wrote all the Proverbs, incredibly wise sayings. Ecclesiastes was an old man looking back on his life about what was good and what was bad. And he summarizes that everything was chasing after the wind, and that the best a man can do is to take satisfaction in the work of his hands, be able to eat and worship God. So perhaps as an older man, perhaps Solomon did come back. We don't know. We won't know till we know. But I thought this was very interesting in the way that this is worded about what David said to him. So perhaps that's kind of a little bit of insight about why he turned, it seemed. And why a man so gifted in wisdom would have 1,000 wives. Okay, going on. Chart 54 on page 215. It's kind of getting into 2nd Chronicles here. So we're going to go through. So at the end of 1st Chronicles, what has happened here is Solomon has been given the plans. David is an elderly man now. He's about to die. Solomon is anointed king at the very end of 1st Chronicles. And then the closing of David's reign. And then so 2nd Chronicles starts with Solomon. So he starts out to, his first task is to build the house of the Lord. So in this, he establishes himself, and then chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all about the temple. And then 8 is about his other projects, and then chapter 9 is about his death. So in 2nd Chronicles, the first half, or the first 9 chapters, is about Solomon, and then the rest of it is about all these other kings that came along, the kings of the southern tribes. I think there was 14 of them. So remember, 1st Chronicles was genealogy into David. 2nd Chronicles is Solomon, and then the rest of the shorter kings of the southern tribes. Okay, so in chapters 1 through 9, Solomon's reign and the temple project. Solomon becomes king at the end of Chronicles. 1st Chronicles is the death of David. In the first chapter of 2nd Chronicles, Solomon asks for wisdom as he starts his reign, and then in chapters 2 and 4, the temple is built and furnished. When Solomon became king, in chapters 1, verse 3, then Solomon and all the assembly with him went to the high place that was at Gibeon, for the tabernacle of meeting with God was there, which Moses, the servant of the wilderness, had made in the wilderness. But David had brought the ark of God from Kershaw Jerom to the place David had prepared for it, for he had pitched a tent there. So when he first becomes king, he and all his assembly go to Gibeon to the tabernacle. So we know at this point the tabernacle is still there. And he goes there, and it says, and Solomon went up to the bronze altar before the Lord, which was the tabernacle of meetings, and offered 1,000 burnt offerings on it. On that night God appeared to Solomon and said to him, "Ask what I shall give you." So what Solomon does, he's now been appointed king. But the first thing he does is he goes to the tabernacle, the original tabernacle from Moses, which is in Gibeon. He goes there and offers 1,000 sacrifices, and then God appears to him and says, "Ask me whatever you want." And that's when he asks for wisdom. So he actually has an appearance of God. He has two. God appears to him actually twice. So this is the first one. So in the story of him asking for wisdom, he goes to the temple and gives 1,000 sacrifices first. So before we ask anything of God, maybe we should do likewise, So to get this prayer answered in an incredible way, he did an incredible thing by doing that. Then he goes, so he starts his reign like that. What would it be like if one of our presidents did that? First thing he went to the house of the Lord and offers gifts and offerings to God, and then prays to him first, and then I don't know, it might work. So we see here that God says, "Ask what you want." Solomon said, "You have shown great mercy to David, my father. You have made me king over people like the dust of the earth. Now give me wisdom and knowledge that I may go out and come in before the people who can judge this people of yours. So because this was in your heart, and you have not asked for riches or wealth, but have asked for wisdom and knowledge for yourself, that you may judge my people, I will give you riches and wealth and honor such as none of the kings who have had who were before you, nor shall any after you have the like." So no one since that time would have had that much wealth either. Then after that it says, "Then Solomon came to Jerusalem from the high place at Gibeon, from before the tabernacle of meetings, and reigned over Israel." So the first thing he does in his reign is goes to Gibeon, goes to the tabernacle, makes us worships, has this vision, or God appears to him, he does his prayer, he's given everything, then he goes back to reign. So that's how Chronicles starts out, or 2 Chronicles. So now he goes back to prepare to build the temple. So the temple was the first large single structural undertaken by any Israelite ruler. None of the rulers up to this point have built anything great, other than David building his what do we call it, mansion or whatever. Whoop. Oh, battery went dead. I'm sorry. Okay, hate it when that happens. If I would remember to plug it in, that wouldn't have happened. If I would have offered sacrifices before this, he would have told me, "Plug your computer in." So David has said that it would be exceedingly magnificent. The temple construction began in 966 BC, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, in 480 years after the exodus of Egypt, and it took 7 years to build. In 2 Chronicles 2, we see he conscripted 70,000 men as carriers, 80,000 as stone cutters in the hill country, and 3,600 as foremen over them. This was a big construction project. Hundreds of thousands of workers. The temple was similar in overall layout to the tabernacle, with the holy and most holy place. Solomon, even though great and wise, failed in his faithfulness to God, and the idolatry he later caused the whole nation to be unfaithful to God. In chapter 5, we see the Ark of the Covenant. Remember, right now, David has brought it into Jerusalem. It is in a tent that David put up for it. Now, once the construction is finished, now the Ark of the Covenant is taken into the temple. Why is the Ark of the Covenant important to be in the temple? It has the 10 Commandments in it, but it's God's chair. That is God's throne. That's his seat. It's his mercy seat. So that is what guides. Where the Ark of the Covenant was where the Spirit of God was. Uh-oh. It's that IT guy. I did something wrong. So in chapter 5, we see the Ark of the Covenant taken in the temple in the Holy of Holies, and then the room is filled with a cloud, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple of God. So we see now that the temple is built. They've moved the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, and the Spirit of God descends on it. Where did we see that the first time? The tabernacle, the last chapter of Exodus. Remember? They built the tabernacle, and the last that we see the Spirit of God coming. So now it's in the temple. So obviously they built it well. Okay. So Solomon dies at the end of chapter 9. Now then we see the split of the kingdom. Remember I said it split between Rehoboam and Jeroboam? Rehoboam was the son of Solomon. He got the southern tribe. Jeroboam was this guy who had been like a leader and construction leader for Solomon. He gets the northern tribe. Just like in Kings, we see this story again here. In chapter 10, I'll just kind of share some things with you. Remember I said a lot of it was about taxation? Solomon had started taxing the people pretty hard. And in 10 we see, your father made our yoke heavy. This is the people speaking to Rehoboam. Your father had made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father and the heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. So King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood by his father, that Solomon's still living. So the first thing he does is he goes to the elders. And they say, if you will act kind to these people and please them and speak good words to them, they will be your servants forever. Thinks, nah, that doesn't sound right. So he rejected this and consulted the young men who he had grown up with. And they said, what advice do you give? How should I answer? And he said, the young men who had grown up with said, thus you should speak to the people who have spoken to you. Say, your father made our yoke heavy. I won't need it. Yeah, I'm done. Thanks. Your father who made our yoke heavy, but your father made our yoke heavy, but you will make it lighter on us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My fathers chastised you with whips, I will chastise you with scourges. So the advice of his buddies was, no, make the taxation harder on them. And that's what drove them away. That's why they rebelled and went under Jeroboam as their leader. So it was over taxation. Mind you of a tea party in Boston several hundred years ago, right? So that was what caused the split. And remember I told you about the prophet that had gone to him and tore his cloak into 12 pieces? It says, so the turn of events was from God, that the Lord might fulfill his word, which he had spoken by the hand of Ahijah, the Shionite, to Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Now when all Israel saw that the king did not listen, and the people answered and said, but anyway, it goes through and talks about the rebellion here. So that is what caused the separation between the northern and southern tribes. So this again is also just talking, same stories we saw in Kings. So in this 10:1 through 19, we see the rebellion of the northern tribes. Chapters 12 through 36 record the kings of Judah that reigned from Rehoboam to the time of captivity. So now then, just like Kings, it's going to go about, in 2 Kings, when it talked about all the following kings after Rehoboam in the southern tribes, these chapters are going to go through the same thing. But when we get to 36, chapter 34, where is the Torah? Everybody keep track of where the Torah is? They didn't either. So here we are, several hundred years later, again. In the 18th year of the reign of Josiah, when he had purged the land of the temple, and he sent Shaphan, blah, blah, blah. When they came to Hilkiah the high priest, they delivered the money. Let me see. Move on. Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law and the Lord given by Moses. Thus it happened when the king heard the words of the law, he tore his clothes. Go inquire of the Lord for me that those who are left in Israel and Judah concerning the words of the book that is found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is poured out on us, because our fathers have not kept the word of the Lord to do accordingly that is written in the book. And then we get over here in chapters 34, verse 30. It says, and he read in the hearing all the words of the book of the covenant which had been found in the house of the Lord. So the Torah, the first 5 books of the, I remember when Moses finished it, he gave it to the priest and said, put this with the Ark of the Covenant so that everyone can refer to it and read it and it can always be read. And then we didn't see it for several hundred years until Joshua. And then we don't see it again, and now here we are 400 years later, and they find the Bible again. So if they had been reading the Bible daily or weekly, or even at the 3 feasts that they're supposed to go to, perhaps they wouldn't have been in all this mess. But anyway, under this king, Josiah, they find it again. It says, the king stood in his place and made a covenant before the Lord to follow the Lord and keep his commandments and his testimony and his statutes with all his heart and with all his soul, to perform the works of the covenant that were written in the book. And he made all who were present in Jerusalem and Benjamin take a stand. So the inhabitants of Jerusalem did according to the covenants of God and God of their fathers. Thus Josiah removed all the abominations from the country that belonged to the children of Israel, and made all who were present in Israel diligently serve the Lord their God all his days, and they did not depart from following the Lord their God of their fathers. So we're almost at the end of their history, and they finally find the Bible again. So it keeps getting, people get away from this, our instruction manual, and things kind of get bad. So we saw that here in this chapter 4. Then in chapter 36, the end of 2 Chronicles ends with the fall of Jerusalem, taken over by the Babylonians. Messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his word, and scoffed at his prophet until the wrath of the Lord was roused on his people, and there was no remedy. So in chapter 36, we kind of see the end of this. And then the attack of Nebuchadnezzar. We talked about that kind of during break. I mean, God can use godly people and ungodly people for his purpose, right? So God uses Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians to come against him. And in chapter 36, verse 6, we see Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against him and bound them in bronze fetters to carry him off to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried off some of the articles from the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his temple at Babylon. Jehoiakim was 8 years old when he became king and reigned in Jerusalem 3 months and 10 days and did evil in the sight of the Lord. King Nebuchadnezzar summoned him and took him to Babylon with the costly articles from the house of the Lord. Then Zedekiah did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet and rebelled against the king Nebuchadnezzar. So then in 36:15 we see the fall of Jerusalem. And the Lord God of their fathers sent warnings to them as messengers, because he had compassion on his people and his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord aroused against his people, till there was no remedy. He brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, Nebuchadnezzar, who killed their young men with the sword of the house of the sanctuary, had no compassion on young men or virgin, or the aged or weak, and they all gave him his hands. And all the articles of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the kings of the leaders, and he took to Babylon. Then they burned the house of God, broke down the walls of Jerusalem, burned its palaces with fire, and destroyed its precious possessions. He took them to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the king of Persia, to fulfill the words of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. So here we see that. So the land had to enjoy its 70 Sabbaths. As long as the land lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So this is where that came from. For 490 years, they hadn't kept it. So this is the fall of Jerusalem. So because of their sin, they've gotten away from the word. We only see one time that they read the Bible. or read their Torah, the laws, under one king, then they return to wickedness. So now they have been taken captivity into Babylon. And next week I'll show you where they took me into captivity. Remember Babylon had been the lead empire? In that 70 years that they're in captivity, Persia becomes the new world power. And so Persia takes over, and Persia invades Babylon, and Persia takes over all this. Persia has a new king. Persia has a king named Cyrus. And if you had never heard this, this is just fascinating. Now, the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia. This is about 60, I may be wrong, 66, 67 years after they went into captivity, just a few years before they're going to come out. So now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, the king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the Lord of God of heaven has given me, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judea. Who is among you of all his people? May the Lord God be with him, and let him go up. So what happens here is this new king who has taken over, he goes and he takes over Babylon, he wipes them out. He's got all of these, 2 generations later, all of these, in effect, they're not really prisoners, but these Jews, tribe of Judah and Benjamin and Levites living in these cities. And he says, the God of heaven, your God, has told me to rebuild your house in Jerusalem. Whoever wants to go, you go build it. I'm going to fund it. I'm going to take care of it. You just go build it. I've been told by God to go build it. So God uses Cyrus, a king of Persia, not a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. He uses him to fulfill his purpose to rebuild the temple. And he says anyone who wants to go can go back. We'll see this next week in Ezra and Nehemiah. I said it right. Amazing. In Ezra and Nehemiah, we see him sending them back. And we're going to see a really interesting tie into Esther through all this. So that ends Chronicles. So 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a history from Adam and Eve, the genealogies, through a little bit of information about Saul and King David, King Solomon, the other 14 kings, and then this captivity for 70 years. We see the reason it's 70 years. That's because of the Sabbaths that they have not let for the land. And then we see this probably atheist or agnostic king, Cyrus of Persia, being specifically told by God that he wants him to build the temple for him and send it back. So any questions on Kings and Chronicles? We went through like 3,500 years of history in about 35 minutes. Any comments on that? Or well, we don't know. He didn't grow up with the Torah. We don't know. If God tells him to do something, he did it, then he obviously believed in the God. So I would say there's a good chance he did, yeah. But God moved on. God would have obviously revealed himself to him, right? As the God of heaven. And asked him to do something, and he did it. So that's more than I can say for me most of the time. What's that? Being faithful, yeah. Yes? Not the Ezra and Nehemiah is about 100-year time frame in there, and we'll get into all that next week. And there's Xerxes I, the second Xerxes, and then Esther comes in there, and yeah, it's a pretty fascinating story. But next week we'll go through all that. So it's pretty quick. That first group goes back, and they rebuild There's like 3 returns under Nehemiah, and one of them is to rebuild the wall, the decree to rebuild the wall, which is significant from Daniel's prophecy. Yeah, for the 49 sevens. Yeah. Okay. Anybody want to close us in prayer? Any volunteers? Thank you, Marco.